The night before my son's promotion ceremony, I ironed my best blouse 3 times. It's a pale blue one, linen, with small pearl buttons down the front. I bought it 2 years ago at a Chico's sale, 40% off, and I'd been saving it for something that felt worth it. My son becoming a named partner at 38 years old felt worth it. I pressed every wrinkle out carefully, hung it on the closet door, and went to bed thinking about how proud I was going to feel sitting in that room watching him walk across the stage. I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up and looking at the blouse hanging there in the dark, pale as a ghost. I should have paid more attention to that. My name is Sylvia. I'm 63 years old. I taught 4th grade at Maplewood Elementary in Columbus, Ohio for 31 years. I retired 2 years ago with a small pension, a certificate from the school board, and a classroom full of kids who drew me pictures and cried a little. That meant more to me than the certificate. My son's name is Brandon. He's a corporate attorney. He works at a firm downtown, one of those offices with floor-to-ceiling windows and an espresso machine in every break room. He's sharp and driven, and I love him more than I have words for. I raised him alone after his father left when Brandon was 4. We didn't have much. I clipped coupons and bought shoes 1 size too big so he'd grow into them. I drove him to every debate tournament, every college prep class, every SAT session. When he got into Ohio State on a full academic scholarship, I stood in our tiny kitchen and cried into a dish towel. I worked summer school every year for 6 years to help cover what the scholarship didn't. I didn't take a single vacation during that time, not one. I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me. I'm telling you so you understand what that pale blue blouse meant. Brandon got married 4 years ago. His wife's name is Courtney. She's from Dayton, comes from a family with money. Not generational wealth, but the kind of comfortable that means you never once worried about the electric bill. Her parents, Gerald and Faye, have a lake house in Michigan, a boat they take out on weekends, and a golden retriever named something I can never remember. They're nice enough people, they are. But from the moment Brandon and Courtney got engaged, I noticed something shift. Small things at first. Holiday plans that assumed I'd be flexible while Faye's schedule was non-negotiable. Conversations where Brandon would mention something I'd said and then add, "But Courtney's family does it differently." A birthday dinner where the reservation was made at a restaurant so loud I could barely hear myself think. And when I mentioned it, Courtney laughed and said her mother loved the energy. I kept quiet. I told myself it was normal. Merging families is complicated. I reminded myself that I had raised a good son, and good sons find their footing eventually. I kept telling myself that for 4 years. The ceremony was at the firm's event space downtown, a beautiful room on the 14th floor with views of the city, round tables with white tablecloths, that kind of soft catered lighting that makes everything look like a magazine. Brandon had told me about it weeks in advance. He'd seemed genuinely excited when he told me, or at least I thought he had. I drove downtown alone, paid $12 to park in a garage 2 blocks away, walked in my good flats that I'd also polished the night before. The room was already half full when I arrived. I found the seating chart near the entrance and scanned for my name. It took me a moment to find it. Table 11. I looked at the layout. Table 1 through 4 were up front, closest to the stage, clearly designated for family and senior firm members. I followed the numbers back. Table 11 was near the back, tucked next to the door to the catering station. I stood there for a moment with my finger on the seating chart. Then I picked up my small clutch and walked to table 11 and sat down. The people at my table were lovely, actually. A paralegal named Jody who'd been with the firm for 6 years and her husband, 2 junior associates, both young enough to be my former students. A woman from the firm's communications department who made small talk about the centerpieces. I smiled and nodded and made conversation. Inside, I felt something very quiet and very cold settling in my chest. Across the room, at table 2, I could see Brandon and Courtney. Next to Courtney sat Faye in a cream blazer, already laughing at something the man beside her had said. Gerald was there too, tanned from what I assumed was a recent trip somewhere warm. They looked completely at ease, like they belonged there in a way that I apparently did not. Brandon caught my eye at one point from across the room. He gave me a small wave, not the kind that says I'll come over, the kind that says I see you, we're good. I waved back, kept smiling. Later, when the presentation started and his name was called, Brandon Hadley, named partner, corporate division, I clapped harder than anyone at table 11. Maybe harder than anyone at table 11. Maybe harder than anyone in the room. My hands stung afterward. A senior partner stood at the podium and talked about Brandon's exceptional work ethic, his meticulous attention to detail, his unwavering commitment to clients. Then he said something that made my breath catch. He said, Brandon has spoken often about the values that shaped him. Hard work, resilience, the belief that no obstacle is too large if you're willing to stay the course. I thought about those words. Hard work, resilience. I thought about the shoes bought one size too big. I looked at table 2. Brandon was nodding, composed, looking exactly like the partner they had just named him. Faye leaned over and touched his arm warmly. Courtney squeezed his hand. I looked back at my hands in my lap. At the reception afterward, I waited by the windows with a glass of sparkling water. Brandon came over eventually, maybe 20 minutes later. He hugged me. It was a real hug, or felt like one. Congratulations, I said. I'm so proud of you. Thanks, Mom. He pulled back. Did you find your table okay? I did, I said. He looked over his shoulder at something, someone, and then back at me. Faye and Gerald flew in this morning, he said. Long trip for them. Of course, I said. That was very kind of them. There was a pause. The kind that sits between people like a third person in the room. I should get back, he said. Lots of partners to talk to tonight. Go, I said. This is your night. He patted my arm once and walked back to table 2. I stood by the windows a little longer, looking at the city lights below, and I thought, I ironed that blouse 3 times. I didn't cry in the parking garage. I'd promised myself I wouldn't, and I kept that promise. I drove home on the highway with the radio on low, and the windows cracked even though it was October and cold. I needed the air. When I got home, I hung the pale blue blouse back in the closet and sat at my kitchen table for a long time without turning on any lights. I'm not a dramatic person. I don't catastrophize. I've survived things that were genuinely hard. Single parenthood, a cancer scare at 54, the death of my mother 3 months into my first year of teaching, when I couldn't afford to take more than 2 days off. I know what real grief feels like. I know the difference between a hard moment and a hard life. But sitting at that table in the dark, I let myself feel it. The small, specific pain of being placed at table 11 while the people who had lake houses and boats were at table 2. Of being waved at from across a room by the child I had made out of everything I had. I let myself feel it. And then I decided I was done. Not done with my son, not done with love, but done with folding myself smaller to fit into a space he'd decided I belonged in. The next morning I called my friend Dorothea. We've been friends since our 20s. She taught 5th grade 2 doors down from me for 15 years. She's plain-spoken in the way that only old friends can be. I told her what happened. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, Sylvia, what are you going to do about it? I don't know yet, I said. But I'm going to do something. Here's something Brandon doesn't know about me. Something most people don't know about me, because I've never been the kind of person who leads with it. For the last 8 years, I've been quietly funding a scholarship through the Columbus Public Schools Foundation. It's called the Eleanor Stedman Scholarship. Eleanor was my mother's name. It's modest by some standards, $5,000 a year, given to one graduating senior in the district who demonstrates financial need and academic promise. A kid who's going to have to work for it the way Brandon once did, the way I once did. I started it with money from my mother's small estate after she passed. I've added to it every year since, pulling from my own savings. Not from generosity in the abstract, the kind people announce at galas, from the particular kind of generosity that comes from having been that kid yourself and not forgetting what it felt like. I've never talked about it publicly. I didn't want recognition. I wanted the money to reach the kid who needed it, and that was all. But 8 years of contributions add up, and over time the foundation noticed. 3 weeks after the ceremony, I received a letter from the Columbus Public Schools Foundation inviting me to be honored at their annual recognition luncheon. They cited 8 years of consistent giving, the cumulative impact of the scholarship on 16 students, and what they called my quiet, sustained commitment to educational access in this community. I held the letter and read it twice. Then I called Dorothea again. "I told you," she said immediately. "I told you I didn't tell Brandon about the luncheon ahead of time. I told myself it was because I didn't want to make a big thing of it, and that was partly true. But if I'm being completely honest, there was another part of me, a part I'm not entirely proud of, that wanted to see what would happen if he found out the way everyone else did." The luncheon was held at the Nationwide Conference Center. It was a nicer room than the firm's event space, actually. High ceilings, good acoustics, the kind of linen napkins that are actually cloth. I wore a different blouse, a deep burgundy one I'd bought the week before, full price. The foundation's executive director gave a short speech about the scholarship recipients over the years. She talked about where they were now, 2 in nursing, 1 finishing a law degree, 1 teaching, 1 running a small business. She talked about what consistent support means to a kid who doesn't have a safety net. Then she called my name. I walked up to the front of the room and accepted a crystal award the size of my hand. People I'd never met were standing up and clapping. I thanked my mother, whose name the scholarship carried. I said a few words about what I believed, that every kid deserves someone in their corner, that the gesture doesn't have to be large, it just has to show up every year. I didn't mention Brandon. I didn't have to, because he was there. I hadn't known he'd be invited. The foundation, it turned out, had sent a broader community invitation that included several local firms, including his. He was there with 2 colleagues. I saw his face from the podium when they said my name. He hadn't known. I could see that clearly. The slight forward lean, the way his expression shifted. Not embarrassment, not right away. First just surprise, then something slower. I held his gaze for a moment. I didn't smile pointedly. I didn't perform anything. I just looked at him the way you look at someone you love, from a place that has gotten very steady and very quiet. Then I looked back at the room and finished what I was saying. Courtney pulled me aside in the lobby afterward. I hadn't expected that either. "She's not a bad person, Courtney. I want to be clear about that. I've never thought she was. I've thought she was young and shaped by a family that made certain assumptions about how things should be ordered, and that she'd married a man who had absorbed more of those assumptions than either of them realized." She looked at me in the lobby and I could see she was genuinely moved by what she'd heard. She said I had no idea about any of it. "I know," I said. "The scholarship all those years." She paused. "He didn't know either." "No," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that surprised me. She said, "My mother didn't build anything. I mean, she's wonderful and I love her, but she didn't build anything like that." I didn't know what to say, so I just put my hand briefly on her arm and smiled. Brandon called me that evening. He started talking before I could even say hello, faster than I was used to hearing him talk. A little tangled, which isn't like him. He's a lawyer, he's precise. He untangles things for a living. He said he didn't know about the scholarship, about the foundation, about any of it. I said I knew that. He said he was sorry. And the way he said it, not like a man completing an obligation, but like a man who had been sitting with something uncomfortable for several hours and had worked his way to the real edge of it. I believed him. He said, "I think I've been doing things wrong for a while." I said, "I think so too." He was quiet. Then he said, "The seating at the ceremony, I know that wasn't right. Courtney and I talked about it. I made a bad call. I need a bad call." I didn't tell him it was fine because it wasn't fine, but I didn't pile on either. I just said, "I appreciate that you said that." We talked for a long time after that, longer than we talked in probably 2 years. He asked me about the scholarship recipients, about which ones I'd followed over the years, about my mother. He asked me what she was like. He was 4 when she died. He barely remembered her. I told him a lot that night. When we got off the phone, I sat in the same kitchen I'd sat in 3 weeks earlier in the dark, but this time I turned the lights on. And I thought about something a colleague of mine used to say whenever a parent-teacher conference got difficult. She used to say, "People come back to who raised them. Just give them enough time." I thought about my son, who had gone looking for belonging in a room full of people impressed by his title and his firm and his floor-to-ceiling windows. I thought about how for 34 years, the person who was most impressed by him was the woman at table 11 who pressed her blouse 3 times and clapped until her hands stung. I hope he knows that now. I think he's starting to. A few months have passed since the luncheon. Things between Brandon and me are different, not fixed, not the way you fix something broken. More like how a broken bone heals. It comes back together stronger at the fracture. But you still know it broke. You still feel it sometimes when the weather changes. We have dinner now, once or twice a month. Sometimes at my house, sometimes at theirs. Last time, I sat at their kitchen counter while Courtney showed me a recipe she'd been trying. Brandon stood nearby, not really doing much, just being present in the way he never used to be. It was ordinary. It was good. Faye and Gerald are still part of their lives. They should be. I've never wanted to be at war with anyone. I just want what I've always wanted, to be seen by my own child for what I actually am. Not an embarrassment, not a utility, not someone to seat near the catering door, just his mother, who worked 31 years teaching other people's children, who saved in the dark for years to help strangers who reminded her of him, who ironed a blouse 3 times out of love. That's all I ever was. That's enough. And finally, I think he knows it. I've thought a lot about what happened over the last few months. Not obsessively, I'm past that, but in the quiet way you think about something when you're washing dishes or driving somewhere familiar, when your hands are busy and your mind just wanders where it wants to go. What I keep coming back to is this: nothing that happened was an accident, not the good parts, not the hard parts, not any of it. When I was raising Brandon alone, working summers, buying shoes 1 size too big, I wasn't doing it to earn something later. I wasn't keeping a ledger. I did it because it was right, and because he was mine, and because that's what you do when you love someone who depends on you. But here's what I've learned, slowly and not always gracefully. The choices you make quietly, over years, without applause, they accumulate, they become something solid. And eventually, one way or another, that solidity shows. The scholarship wasn't a strategy. I started it because I remembered what it felt like to be 17 and smart and completely without a safety net, and I didn't want another kid to feel that alone. I kept it quiet because it wasn't for show. It was just the right thing to do with what little extra I had, year after year, for 8 years. I didn't plan for it to be announced at a luncheon. I didn't plan for Brandon to be in the room. I didn't plan for any of the aftermath. That's the thing about doing something genuinely. It doesn't need a plan. It just needs to be real. What I see now, looking back, is that Brandon had been slowly learning the wrong lesson about what mattered. He'd built a life around impressing people, the right firm, the right table, the right family beside him in public. I don't blame him entirely. The world rewards that kind of performance, at least for a while. But performance and substance are different things, and eventually a person figures that out. Sometimes it takes a moment that cuts through all the noise. For him, that moment was hearing his mother's name called in a room full of people he respected, for something she'd done not for recognition, not for him, but simply because it was good. I think about resilience a lot now. Not the word, people use that word too loosely, but the actual thing. What it really means is that you keep building, quietly, even when no one is watching. Especially when no one is watching. That's where character lives. Not in the acceptance speech. In the years before it, when there was no speech coming and you did it anyway. And I think about what I want the rest of my life to look like. I spent so many years making myself smaller, easier to be around, less inconvenient, the kind of presence that doesn't require much accommodation. I'm done with that, not out of bitterness, out of clarity. Courtney said something to me in that lobby that I've turned over many times since. She said her mother hadn't built anything. I think she meant it as a compliment to me, and I took it that way. But I also thought, it's not too late. For any of us. Building isn't about grand gestures. It's about deciding today that your quiet choices are worth making, and then making them year after year, without needing anyone to notice. That's what I hope Brandon carries forward. Not shame about table 11, not guilt. Just the understanding that the people you show up for you without fanfare, without a seat at the front, without recognition, those are the people worth knowing. And if you're lucky enough to have one, you don't seat her near the catering door. You just don't.